He was just an old man on a forgotten ranch. No family, no visitors, just cattle and silence. But when Clint Weaver found a bleeding boy half dead in a dry ravine, he didn't ask questions, he just gave him water. What happened next? A dozen riders on horseback appeared at dawn, not for vengeance, but for memory. What began as a quiet act of kindness would ripple across generations, drawing strangers, warriors, and broken souls to one sacred place. Where the wounded weren't saved, they were seen. And the land? It remembered everything. Clint Weaver had lived on the same 300 acres of sun-baked Wyoming land for nearly 40 years. It was the kind of place where time moved slow and the horizon never seemed to change. Dust clung to every window pane, and the wind spoke in the creaks of wooden fences and the groan of screen doors. He was 62 years old, lean as a fence post, with skin toughened by sun and wind. The kind of man whose words came slow, measured, and usually after a long pull from a tin cup of coffee. The Weaver Ranch sat between nothing and nowhere, halfway between the last paved road and a line of buttes that marked the edge of the Wind River Reservation. Clint kept to himself, as did most folks out that way. He had no family left. His wife, Lena, had passed 10 years back from a winter illness that came fast and didn't listen to prayer. Their only child, a son named Calvin, had died young, a drowning accident that still visited Clint's dreams more often than he cared to admit. Since then it had been him, a few dozen head of cattle, and the ghosts that lived in the dry whisper of prairie grass. It was on a Thursday morning, late August, when the wind changed. He'd been checking fence lines, boot steps heavy on the cracked earth, when he first noticed the shape, slumped against the far side of a dry ravine that hadn't held water in months. A figure, human, barely moving. Clint squinted under the rim of his weathered hat. The sun was fierce that day, high and punishing. He slid down the gully's side, boots kicking up dry dust, and approached slowly. As he drew near, he could see the man's chest rising, faint but steady. Young, maybe early 20s, long black hair matted with sweat and dust. His skin, though dark with sun, was pale beneath the blood. A wound in his side looked like a gunshot. "Jesus," Clint muttered, crouching beside him. The young man stirred, a weak flinch of his arm. His lips were cracked, eyes barely open. Clint reached for the canteen at his belt and unscrewed the cap. "Easy now," he said, more to himself than the boy. "Don't go dying before I can get a word out of you." He held the canteen to the boy's lips, tilting gently. The water disappeared in a rush, some of it spilling down his chin. When he coughed, it brought blood to his lips, but he didn't stop drinking. That's it. Get your fill." Clint sat back on his heels. He looked around. No sign of a horse, no backpack, no gear, just the young man and the open plains. He knew these lands well enough to know this boy hadn't walked far, not with that wound, which meant someone had brought him here or dumped him. "Where the hell did you come from?" Clint murmured. The boy tried to speak, but no words came, just a rasp and a pained breath. Clint stood, brushing dirt off his knees. He didn't think long, not because he wasn't cautious, but because something in the boy's eyes reminded him of Calvin, something scared and stubborn all at once. He hoisted the young man onto his shoulders with a grunt, bones complaining under the weight. It took the better part of an hour to make it back to the house. The sun cooked the land beneath him, but Clint kept walking. By the time he laid the boy down on the faded couch in his front room, the man was unconscious again. Clint fetched water, alcohol, thread, and an old needle he hadn't used since Lena got sick. He cleaned the wound as best he could, wincing for the boy with every stitch. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but infection was the real threat now. Clint didn't know the boy's name, but he sat with him through the night anyway, dozing in a chair with a shotgun by the door, just in case. Not because he expected trouble, just because he'd lived too long not to. When morning came, the boy was still breathing, feverish but alive. Clint stepped outside to clear his head. The porch boards creaked under his boots. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, and the sky glowed the soft blue of early morning. He poured himself coffee from the tin pot and leaned against the railing. That's when he saw them. First, just a shimmer on the rise, like heat waves off the dirt. Then, motion, horses. Clint straightened. 10, maybe more. Riders moving fast but disciplined. They crested the hill like ghosts, the dust trailing behind them in a long whispering cloud. He reached slowly for the rifle that leaned against the porch rail. Didn't raise it, just held it in his hands. They rode in tight formation, men and women both, wearing long braids and woven bandanas. Beads glinted in the morning light. At the head rode a woman, perhaps 50, her gaze sharp as the edge of a blade. She pulled her horse to a halt 10 paces from Clint's porch. The rest of the riders fanned out behind her. No one spoke. "You Clint Weaver?" the woman asked. He nodded. "I am." "We were told he was here." Clint didn't need to ask who she meant. "Found him yesterday," he said, voice steady. "Barely breathing. Looked like he took a bullet." "He did." "Don't know his name." The woman dismounted in one smooth motion, boots landing in dust. "His name is Eli. He's my nephew." Clint's eyes flicked over the group. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they carried themselves like soldiers, warriors. The kind of people who didn't take to begging, the kind who earned their scars. "I didn't know who he was," Clint said. "Didn't care, really. Boy was dying. Gave him water. Brought him here. Did what I could." The woman studied him, measuring something in his face. Then she nodded once, a quiet gesture of respect. "May I see him?" Clint stepped aside. She entered the house without another word, her boots leaving prints in the dust that clung to the floor. One by one, the rest followed. Some stayed outside, securing horses or scanning the distance. Others came in quiet, filling the small house with the scent of leather and sage. Inside, the woman knelt beside the couch. Eli was asleep, breathing shallowly. She reached out, brushed hair from his face, then turned to Clint. "You cleaned him well," she said. "He'll live." Clint said nothing, just watched as she pulled a small satchel from her hip and began to unwrap herbs, powder, small glass bottles. The rest of the day passed in silence. Clint moved around the house like a ghost in his own space. The strangers didn't eat his food, didn't ask for anything. They simply tended to the boy, speaking in soft tones in a language Clint didn't understand but felt somehow all the same. By nightfall, a small fire had been built behind the house. The riders took shifts keeping watch, as if expecting something or someone to follow. Clint didn't ask. He figured if they wanted him to know, they'd tell him. On the third day, Eli woke. He was weak but alert. His first words were not of pain or confusion. He looked at Clint and said, "You didn't have to help me." Clint nodded. "Maybe not, but I did." Why? Clint thought about that. He could have said it was because it was the right thing to do, or because he'd seen too much dying in his life. But instead he just said, "Thirsty man don't need a reason to be handed water. He just needs someone who notices he's dry." Eli didn't respond, but his eyes said enough. That night Clint learned the truth. Eli had been targeted by a pair of poachers, men who crossed into reservation land and didn't like being told no. Eli had confronted them when they were hunting elk out of season, sacred animals to his people. The confrontation turned violent. One of the men pulled a gun. Eli fled. They chased him until he was wounded and left for dead in the desert. They didn't expect him to survive. "They crossed a line," said the woman, Eli's aunt. "And they think no one will care." Clint's jaw tensed. He'd heard stories like that before. He also knew the sheriff in the county seat 50 miles south wouldn't lift a finger. Too many scars in this land. Too much silence where justice should have lived. "What do you plan to do?" Clint asked. The woman looked toward the fire. "We came for Eli. We'll leave when he can ride. What comes after? That is not your burden." But Clint didn't sleep well that night. Not because he feared them, but because he feared what would happen when people didn't take kindness as seriously as they took power. 3 days later, Eli was on his feet. The riders packed quietly. Before they mounted up, the woman approached Clint again. "You saved a life," she said. Clint shook his head. "Just did what a man should." She extended her hand. In it, a small bundle wrapped in leather. Inside, Clint would later find a hand-carved feather made of bone, etched with symbols he didn't recognize. "A gift," she said, "from our people. A promise." "To what?" She smiled, a rare crack in her hard exterior. "To remember." They left as they came, silent, swift, and surrounded by dust. Clint watched until they disappeared over the ridge. He never saw them again. But 3 months later, when fire swept across the eastern buttes and the volunteer crews ran thin, a group of riders appeared at night, hauling water, clearing brush, and rebuilding fences. They didn't speak much, but Clint recognized the woman among them, and beside her, Eli, strong again, eyes clear. He didn't stay, but he left behind a flask of sweet tea and a note. "Water for the thirsty, kindness for the forgotten. We remember." Clint folded the note and slipped it into the pocket of his coat over his heart, and from that day on he kept a second canteen tied to his saddle, just in case. Clint's life resumed its rhythm after that, though something subtle had shifted. The days still began with coffee at sunrise and fence inspections before noon, but the air felt different, less hollow, as if the land itself had exhaled some of its sorrow. When the wind came in from the west, it carried with it a scent he couldn't name but recognized nonetheless. Not sage, not smoke, something older, something sacred. The bundle the woman had given him sat on the mantel above the fireplace, the carved feather resting on an old handkerchief folded with the kind of precision Clint normally reserved for rifle cleaning. He hadn't told anyone what had happened. There wasn't anyone to tell, really. But he kept that feather there, and when the nights grew long and the house echoed with the absence of conversation, he'd glance up at it, just once, just enough to remind himself it was real. Winter came fast that year, early and sharp. Snow dusted the fields in early October and didn't fully melt until spring. Clint kept the cattle close and the barn warmer than usual. The roads were often impassable, and for weeks at a time he saw no one at all. But the silence no longer seemed so cruel. Then, sometime in late January, just after a blizzard had buried the fence posts in white drifts, Clint noticed tracks leading up to his porch. Not boot prints. Hooves. 4 of them, small and light. He opened the front door to find a horse tied neatly to the hitching post. No rider in sight. But slung over the saddle horn was a deerskin pouch. Inside it, he found dried herbs, a small pouch of tea, and a folded note written in neat looping script. "When the cold takes the land, share this with the fire, for strength, for peace. We do not forget." It wasn't signed. Didn't need to be. Clint brewed the tea that night. Its flavor was sharp, bitter at first, then smooth. He felt it down to his bones. He slept deeper than he had in years. The visits continued. All was silent. Gifts left under moonlight. A small bundle of jerky. A hand-woven sash. A stone carved in the shape of a buffalo. Left on the windowsill. Clint never saw who left them. Never asked. In return, he started leaving things, too. A jar of honey. A warm pair of gloves. Firewood split and stacked neatly beside the post. It became their ritual. Then, one spring morning, as the last snow was melting and the creek behind the barn gurgled with thaw, Clint found a rider waiting at the gate. It was Eli. He was taller now, broader. A man fully grown. His hair was tied back, and a bow slung across his back beside a quiver of arrows so beautiful they looked ceremonial. He dismounted with ease and offered his hand. Clint took it. "You remember me?" Eli asked, smiling. "Wouldn't forget if I tried." "I came to ask a favor." Clint raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "There's a fire coming." Clint thought at first he meant metaphorically, but then Eli unfurled a map, spreading it across the porch table. It showed the mountains, valleys, and the reservation border, and a long, sweeping path of red ink, drawn with care. "Lightning strike 2 days ago," Eli said. "Wind's been carrying it east." "How bad?" "Worse than they're saying." Clint looked over the land he'd known all his life. The fire line cut through it like a wound. "What do you need?" "Water, shelter, a staging point." Clint didn't hesitate. "You got it." That week was a blur of motion. Trucks rolled in, horses were stabled, men and women, young and old, moved with the kind of coordinated grace Clint hadn't seen since his younger days working cattle drives. But this was different. This was urgent, sacred. The fire arrived 3 days later, roaring like some ancient beast awakened from a long sleep. The sky turned to smoke. Ash fell like snow. But the people stood ready. Lines were held. Land was saved. And when the wind finally changed direction, it wasn't the fire that pushed it back. It was them. Clint stood beside Eli at the edge of the field, both watching as the last embers cooled into nothingness. "You didn't have to help us," Eli said. Clint gave a small smile. "Thirsty land don't need a reason to be given water, just needs someone who notices it's dry." Eli laughed softly. "You always talk like a story's already half told." "Maybe it is." That night the camp behind the ranch came alive. Drums, singing, a circle of people gathered around fire, not for warmth, but for memory. Clint sat just beyond the circle, listening. When one of the older men approached with a carved pipe, Clint accepted it without a word. "You've given much," the man said. "Didn't feel like much. That's how you know it mattered." By the time the firelight had died and the sky was painted with early stars, Clint felt something new settle in his chest. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something quieter, belonging. Months passed, then a year. Clint turned 63, then 64. He stopped marking birthdays after that. His hair turned fully white. His hands grew more calloused. The cattle still needed tending, and the fences still fell. But the land felt more alive. He knew now that he was not alone. And then, on a day not unlike the first, hot, dry, humming with silence, another rider came, this one younger, a girl, maybe 16, with fierce eyes and a feather in her braid. She handed Clint a small box. Inside was a medal, military, polished and engraved. Clint stared. "I don't understand." "It belonged to Eli's father," the girl said. "He died last winter. Eli said you should have it." Clint held the medal in his hands. The weight of it, the story behind it, the trust it represented. He looked at the girl. "What's your name?" "Amira." "You hungry, Amira?" She smiled. "A little." "Well then," Clint said, pushing open the door, "come on in. Let's get you fed." The world hadn't changed. Not really. There were still fences to mend, still poachers, still silence in the halls of justice. But on one ranch, tucked between nowhere and memory, kindness was currency. And it bought more than water or bread. It bought peace. Years later, when Clint was long gone and the ranch had passed into other hands, the story remained, passed in whispers, shared in firelight, about a man who gave water to a wounded boy, and how the next day the entire tribe came on horseback. Not for revenge, but for remembrance. Clint didn't sleep that night, not really. He dozed on and off in his armchair by the front window, the kind of shallow, restless sleep where your mind doesn't quite let go. Outside, the fire pit crackled softly in the dark, and silhouettes moved around it, quiet voices, low chants, the rustle of feathers and buckskin. They weren't guests, not in the traditional sense. They were guardians, watchers, protectors of something old and deep-rooted. He didn't know most of their names, and they never asked his. But a bond had been formed, wordless and unbreakable. Sometime before dawn, Clint stepped outside with a blanket draped over one shoulder and his old kettle in hand. He set it on the iron arm above the embers and waited as the water began to simmer. One of the young men, no older than 20, approached, his step soft against the dirt. "You keep watch all night?" the boy asked. Clint nodded. "Old habits." The boy sat across from him, cross-legged. "Eli says you gave him water when he couldn't speak." "I did. And patched him up. Best I could." The boy looked into the flames. "My uncle used to say the land watches everything. It remembers things people forget." Clint didn't answer right away. He stirred the kettle, then poured a bit of water into his tin cup, testing the heat. "Your uncle was right," he finally said. "This land don't forget." The boy nodded, then stood and disappeared into the stillness, his place taken a few minutes later by one of the women, older, her hair streaked with gray and silver beads woven in tight. She handed Clint a bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Inside he found 3 small stones painted with symbols in red and black. "For your home," she said. "Protection." Clint held them carefully. "You believe in this?" She looked at him evenly. "I don't need to believe. I remember." By mid-morning, the gathering began to break apart. The horses were fed, the fires doused. One by one they rode out, north, east, some toward the reservation, others toward the mountains beyond, but not all of them left. A few remained behind to help rebuild a portion of the north fence that had fallen during the fire season. Eli stayed too, though he said little. It was only on the second evening after the riders arrived, as the last of the stragglers departed, that Eli spoke with weight behind his voice. "They'll come back," he said, sitting on the porch rail while Clint split firewood nearby. Clint glanced up. "Who?" "The poachers." Clint straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "You sure?" "They've done it before. They'll do it again." Clint tossed a log onto the growing pile. "Then we'll be ready." That night the air was thick with a strange quiet. No wind, no coyote calls, not even the hum of insects. Clint didn't sleep, neither did Eli. They took turns walking the perimeter, flashlights off, rifles slung over their shoulders. It was sometime after midnight when the dogs barked, low and fast. Clint froze near the barn. Eli appeared from the other side of the cattle pen, eyes sharp. Then they saw them. 2 figures, barely visible, ducking between the scrub brush near the far gate. No headlights, no engine, just the sound of crunching dirt and the quiet shuffling of boots that didn't belong. Clint didn't yell. He didn't fire a warning shot. He just raised the barrel of his rifle and called out once, "Stop right there!" The figures froze. A voice answered, cocky and sharp. "It's just open land, old man. Didn't see no signs." "Don't need signs," Clint said. "You're not welcome here." Eli stepped beside him, silent, solid. One of the men laughed. "Oh, it's the kid. Thought you'd be long gone by now." "Not this time," Eli said, voice low. There was movement, too fast, and Clint saw the flash of metal, a gun. But Eli was faster. One shot rang out sharp and clean. The figure dropped. The second man took off running, boots pounding into the dark. Clint and Eli moved fast, crossing the field, scanning for more. But it was over in seconds. When they reached the body, they found a young man, early 30s, maybe, face frozen in surprise. The gun still clutched in his hand. Clint knelt beside him, checked the pulse, shook his head. "Didn't have to be this way," he said quietly. The next morning, they called the tribal liaison first, not the sheriff. It was handled with respect, without spectacle. The man was buried not far from where he fell. A few prayers, a few words. No one gloated. No one cheered. The land, as always, remained silent. The incident was never written up in any local paper. But the word spread, and from that moment on, the lines were understood. The Weaver Ranch was no longer just land. It was memory. It was story. And story, in the right hands, could be sacred. A week later, Clint found another gift left at his doorstep. A small leather-bound book, hand-stitched and filled with blank pages. On the inside cover, a single sentence had been written in careful, looping script. For the water-bearer, the fire-watcher, and the one who sees before asking why. He began to write in it, each morning with his coffee, not long passages, just moments, like how the deer returned to the field near the oak, or how Eli taught him to tell the difference between wolf tracks and coyote, or how the silence between two people could sometimes feel louder than a storm. And so the story continued. The days grew longer as spring stretched into early summer, and Clint found the rhythms of ranch life changed in quiet, subtle ways. Where once he had only cattle and his own stubborn heartbeat to keep him company, now there was Eli, who had begun repairing the older fence lines not out of obligation, but out of respect. The boy had gone from wounded stranger to something like kin, not with declarations or long talks, but with shared labor, with silence that didn't press or prod, and with the way he always left the last piece of bread untouched at dinner, the way Clint used to do when Lena was still alive. They didn't speak much about that night, the gunshot, the body, the way the land itself seemed to hold the memory like breath caught in a long-held prayer. But it lingered, not heavy, just permanent. One evening in late June, Clint and Eli sat on the porch watching the horizon bleed into dusk. The sky was a watercolor of reds and purples, streaked with golden clouds. The cattle were quiet, the wind soft. A peaceful evening, the kind that wrapped itself around your ribs and whispered, "Remember this." "I think I'll leave soon," Eli said, breaking the long silence. Clint didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his coffee, now cold. "Where to?" "Back to the tribe. There's talk of starting a youth council. They want me to help." Clint nodded slowly, eyes still on the horizon. "Sounds like something that needs doing. I wouldn't have been ready a year ago." "You're ready now?" Eli's mouth twitched in something close to a smile. "Maybe, maybe not. But I think I've learned what I needed here." Clint set the mug down beside his boot. "You'll do good work." Eli turned toward him. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Clint chuckled low and soft. "Where would I go? Somewhere quieter, maybe? This is the quietest place I know." They sat in that moment a while longer, and neither spoke again until the sun dipped fully behind the distant hills. 2 days later, Eli packed his saddlebag. Clint didn't say goodbye, didn't have to. Instead, he handed him a small bundle of cloth. Inside was the leather-bound journal, the one with only a few pages filled. "Finish it," Clint said simply. Eli nodded. "You sure?" "Stories belong to the ones who live 'em." He mounted his horse and rode off without looking back, the sun rising behind him, casting long shadows across the land that had healed him. Clint watched until the dust settled, then turned and went back to the house. The days after Eli's departure were quiet. Too quiet, maybe. The wind sounded lonelier somehow. The cattle didn't seem to roam as far. Even the birdsong felt restrained, like the land itself was mourning a voice that had left. But Clint didn't complain. He got up every day, fed the animals, walked the fence lines, boiled his coffee over a fire he built just the way Lena used to like it. Then one morning, weeks after Eli had gone, Clint found something waiting on the porch. A hand-carved flute. It lay across his doormat, wrapped in a blue cloth embroidered with white beads. A note was tucked beneath it. "So that the wind on your land can have a voice again." No signature, none was needed. Clint brought the flute inside, set it gently on the table beside the carved feather, and stared at it for a long time. He wasn't a musician, couldn't read a lick of sheet music. But that evening, when the sun slid down low and the air went still, he lifted the flute to his lips and tried. The note was shaky, uncertain, but it rang out true. It echoed across the fields like a call remembered, and somewhere out there, in the woods or on the wind, he imagined it was heard. That summer, strangers began to appear at the gate, not tourists, not passers-by, veterans, widows, fathers with sons, grandmothers with young girls and tired eyes, and they didn't ask to stay. They just came, stood a while at the edge of the land, and left something behind, a ribbon, a rock, a small coin pressed into the dirt. One man left a photograph of a brother who never came home. Another carved his son's initials into the back of the hitching post with a quiet reverence Clint didn't disturb. He understood. The land was becoming something more, not sacred in the way of temples or churches, but sacred in the way of memory. That fall, a woman came carrying a satchel and an old faded flag. She introduced herself as a schoolteacher from the reservation, said she was building a curriculum around untold stories of Native resilience and the unsung kindnesses of those who stood quietly beside them. "I want to include what happened here," she said, her voice soft but steady. Clint shook his head. "Ain't my story to tell." She paused. "Then tell me what you remember." He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "I remember he was thirsty, and I had water, that's all." She smiled and nodded, writing that down. Weeks later, a small wooden sign appeared at the edge of the road leading to his ranch. Hand-painted, modest. Weaver's Land, a place of remembering. Clint didn't put it there, didn't know who did, but he left it standing, because it was true. Winter returned, as it always did, with a slow, grinding weight. Snow piled against the barn. The wind howled through cracks Clint had meant to seal, but never got around to. He started keeping the fire going through the night. The silence returned, but it was a different kind now. Not loneliness, just stillness, a held breath. On the last day of the year, Clint stood on the back porch wrapped in his thickest coat. The stars above stretched endlessly, cold and bright. He held the feather in one hand, the flute in the other, and looked out over the frozen fields that had shaped him, broken him, healed him. He thought about Lena, about Calvin, about Eli, about the boy with the wound who drank water from a stranger's hand and gave back 1,000-fold without ever asking. He raised the flute to his lips again and played. The note that came was stronger this time, steadier, and it carried across the land like a blessing. The snow melted slower that year, clinging to the shaded sides of the barn and forming narrow rivers through the pasture, once the sun finally began to warm the ground again. Clint felt it in his bones, that slow turn toward spring. His knees ached more than usual, and some mornings his fingers were so stiff he had to soak them in hot water before he could grip a shovel or a pitchfork. But he welcomed the ache, because it meant another winter survived, another season turned. He began keeping a journal again, not the one he'd given to Eli, but a new one, a plain black notebook he'd found in a box in the attic beside an old bridle and a photograph of Lena on their wedding day. In the journal, he wrote about the weather, the cattle, and the subtle changes in the wind. But sometimes, late at night, he wrote memories, not full stories, just glimpses. March 3rd, found a feather on the windowsill, white, tipped in gray. Same as the one the woman wore in her braid. Don't remember leaving the window open. April 12th, dreamt of water. Not rain, not rivers, just a hand holding a cup out toward someone I couldn't see. Woke up thirsty. May 7th, coyote. Howled just after midnight. Not a threat, a song. I listened. The land was quieter in spring. Less wind, less fire, more growth. Wildflowers dotted the hills, and the cattle fattened on new grass. Clint had never been sentimental about flowers, but this year he noticed them more. Purple ones, yellow ones, a kind of low-blooming blue that reminded him of the riverbeds near his childhood home in Montana. He was cleaning out the shed one afternoon when he heard hooves. Not hurried, not stealthy, just steady. When he turned, a boy no older than 12 sat astride a paint pony at the edge of the property, one hand gripping the reins, the other holding something wrapped in hide. His face was unreadable, but his posture was respectful, waiting. Clint approached slowly. "You lost?" The boy shook his head. "My mother said you helped Eli." Clint tipped his hat. "I gave him water, that's all." The boy nodded and extended the wrapped bundle. "Then I was told to give you this." Clint took it, unwrapping the hide with careful fingers. Inside was a small polished bowl carved from riverstone. Its edges were smooth, and a design, 3 waves inside a circle, was etched into its bottom. "It's for holding rain," the boy said, "in case the sky forgets." Clint didn't answer. He just stared at the gift for a long moment, then looked back at the boy. "Tell your mother I said thank you." "I will." The boy turned the pony with a gentle tug and rode off without another word, his figure small against the horizon. Clint placed the bowl on the porch railing that night. A storm was expected, and true enough, the clouds rolled in after dusk. Rain came slow and steady, tapping the roof and gathering in the bowl until it overflowed. Clint sat beside it, a blanket over his shoulders, and watched the drops fall like prayer beads from the sky. That summer, a group of riders came again, not as many as before, just 7. They brought news. Eli had been chosen to speak before the tribal elders. He had mentioned Clint by name, had called him the water-bearer. One of the riders, a woman in her 20s with eyes the color of pine bark, handed Clint a sealed envelope. Inside was a photograph, Eli, standing beneath a banner made of woven cloth, symbols painted across it. In his hand was Clint's old journal. Below the image, Eli had written, "Some stories begin with a wound, others begin with water. Mine began with both." Clint read the words 3 times before folding the photo and tucking it into the pocket inside his flannel shirt. He carried it there for weeks. By early autumn, the land had grown quiet again. The cattle grazed slower. The trees along the creek turned gold and red. Clint spent more time sitting on the porch than working. Some days, when the sun was just right, he'd catch sight of something moving far off, a rider on a ridge, a shadow against the sky, and he'd raise his hand in greeting, whether they saw him or not. Then, in late September, something unexpected happened. A truck pulled into his driveway, not a rancher's truck, not reservation folk, a black government-issued vehicle with tinted windows and military plates. Clint stood from the porch, hands instinctively brushing the dust from his jeans. A man stepped out, clean-shaven, mid-40s, sunglasses tucked into the front of his shirt. He walked like someone used to giving orders, but smart enough to keep quiet until necessary. "Mr. Weaver?" "Depends who's asking." The man extended a hand. "Colonel James Rowland, U.S. Army." Clint didn't shake, just waited. "I'm here because of something you did," the colonel continued. "Last year, you helped a boy named Eli." Clint squinted. "And?" "Word reached us, through unofficial channels. I've been speaking with some of the elders at Wind River. They said I should come see you myself." "Why?" The colonel glanced at the porch, at the carved feather still resting in its place, at the bowl full of last night's rain. "Because sometimes," he said, "recognition matters." Clint didn't move. "Not interested in medals." "I didn't bring any." "What did you bring?" The colonel pulled an envelope from his jacket. "A letter, from someone you served with. Name of Ray Halverson." Clint blinked. "Ray's dead." "He was. This was found in a lockbox by his daughter after he passed. It's addressed to you." Clint took the envelope with careful fingers, sat back down in his chair without another word. The colonel didn't linger, just tipped his head and returned to his vehicle. The truck pulled away in silence, tires whispering against gravel. Clint waited until the dust settled before opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and creased. Clint, if you're reading this, it means someone did the right thing. I always figured you'd be the one who remembered how. You had it in you. The rest of us just tried to keep up. The war took a lot from us, but it never took your decency. I hope, wherever you are, you gave something back to the world. Something quiet, something no one else saw, but mattered anyway. Semper Fi, old friend. Ray. Clint sat with that letter until the sun dipped behind the buttes and the wind came down off the hills in long, tired breaths. He didn't cry, but his hands shook a little when he folded the paper back up and placed it beside Eli's photo in his shirt pocket. 2 weeks later, the sign at the edge of the road changed again. Someone had added to it. Weaver's Land, a place of remembering, where the thirsty are seen. Clint never touched it, never spoke of it, but every time a rider appeared at the gate, or a mother brought her child just to sit near the porch, or an elder placed tobacco at the base of the big oak tree out back, Clint made sure they had water, and food, and silence if they needed it, words if they asked, because sometimes all a person needed was to be seen, and on that land they always were. The first snow of Clint's 68th winter arrived soft and silent, blanketing the fields in white before dawn. He had woken earlier than usual, the kind of wakefulness that didn't come from a sound or a dream, but from instinct, the same way he could tell when a calf was about to be born or when a storm would roll in before the sky even changed. He stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, and looked out over the land. Everything was still, clean, as if the world had paused just long enough to let the earth rest, the kind of morning that made you feel like the last living thing in a painting. Then he saw it, hoofprints in the snow, not new, not fresh, but visible. 4 sets, coming from the west side of the ridge. He hadn't heard horses, hadn't seen riders, but the prints were there leading to the old oak behind the barn. He followed them slowly, the cold biting at his legs through the flannel. When he reached the tree, he found what they had left. A circle of stones arranged with precision and care. In the center sat a folded cloth bundle. Clint knelt, brushing snow from the edges, and opened it with calloused fingers. Inside were 3 items: a single braid of black hair bound in red thread, a beaded bracelet with his initials woven in turquoise and white, and a note written in a neat, looping script. We remember the man who gave without asking, who fed without questions, who saw and did not turn away. As long as this land stands, so will the story. You are not forgotten. There was no signature. He stood there a long time, snow gathering on his shoulders, the cold forgotten. When he returned to the house, he placed the bundle beside the rain bowl on the porch. The water inside hadn't frozen, not once. He didn't understand how. He didn't try to. In the weeks that followed, he began to slow down, not from sickness, just time. Some mornings he sat in his chair till noon, the fire crackling behind him, the world moving outside without need of his hand, and still people came. One day it was a mother and her 2 children, both clutching drawings of buffalo and birds. The next a man who had fought in 2 wars and cried at the foot of the oak tree without saying a word. Another time a woman came with ashes in a wooden box and asked if she could scatter them by the creek. Clint only nodded. He had become the keeper of this strange, quiet place, not by intention, just by choice. A single choice. Water for a dying boy, and that was all it had taken. One night, near the end of that long winter, Clint lit a fire behind the barn, not for guests, not for ceremony, just for himself. He sat with a blanket wrapped over his knees and the journal Eli had returned to him not long ago, now filled with pages and pages of words, stories, sketches, names. Eli had written it all. Clint turned to the last page. If I have learned anything, it is this. We are not meant to save the world. We are meant to offer our hands to the ones within reach. You reached, Clint. And because you did, I never drowned." Below the words, Eli had drawn a small symbol, a water droplet falling into an open palm. Clint closed the book. Tears didn't come. They didn't need to. Some emotions ran so deep they didn't show on the surface. That night, he left the journal on the porch railing beside the rain bowl and the memory stone. In the morning, it was gone. He didn't feel robbed. He felt understood. Spring came again, then another summer. Clint turned 70, though he didn't mark the day. He didn't need to. Each morning he woke, drank his coffee, and stepped into the sunlight. It was enough. Eventually, his steps slowed further. His hands shook when he fed the chickens. Some days he didn't make it out to the fields. But the land didn't punish him for his aging. It waited, gently. Then one morning Clint didn't wake. The fire had gone out in the hearth. The coffee kettle still sat on the stove, filled with yesterday's water. But his boots were by the door, his coat on its peg, and on the table sat a folded cloth napkin holding a single piece of cornbread. Outside, the porch was lined with tokens, feathers, beads, coins, letters, photographs, drawings. They came from every direction. Riders on horseback, cars from 5 different states, children, elders, warriors, teachers, priests, lost ones, found ones. They came because a man had once offered water to someone who couldn't ask. They came because he had asked nothing in return. They came because memory, when tended properly, blooms into legacy. The house was left untouched. The rain bowl stayed filled. And beside the old oak, someone carved a final message into the wood. Clint Weaver. He asked no questions. He simply saw and gave. And when the wind passed through the tall grass that summer, it carried not just the sound of rustling leaves, but the echo of a flute played by unseen hands, rising like smoke, falling like rain. The spring after Clint's 70th birthday was the wettest he could remember. Rain came in steady pulses across the plains, not in violent storms, but in long, patient curtains, soaking the earth so deep that wildflowers began to bloom in places he hadn't seen them in years. Purple shooting stars, blue flax, tiny clusters of Indian paintbrush, like the land itself was offering some long overdue apology. Clint stood at the edge of his porch most mornings with a blanket over his shoulders, coffee cooling in his hands, and watched the mist crawl over the hills like a slow tide. His body hurt more now. His hips had turned against him, stiff and cracking with every step, and his breath came with a whistle on colder mornings. But he didn't curse his body for its betrayals. He thanked it quietly for carrying him this far. He had no idea, on the morning of the 7th day of rain, that someone was coming. The knock at his door was soft, almost unsure. 3 taps spaced apart. Clint opened it without hesitation, already knowing in his bones it wasn't a stranger. The girl standing there was maybe 15. Soaked from head to toe, mud streaked up the legs of her jeans, a backpack slung over one shoulder like it was the only thing anchoring her to the ground. Her eyes, wide and watchful, locked with his. "You Clint Weaver?" she asked. He nodded. "Come in. You're cold." She hesitated only a second before stepping inside. He handed her a towel and pointed her toward the stove, where a fire had been burning low all morning. She moved like someone who didn't trust comfort, who didn't believe the warmth would last. He didn't ask why she was there, not yet, not ever, if she didn't want to tell. She spoke first, after she'd sat on the floor near the stove, knees drawn up to her chest, steam rising from her shoulders. "My grandma used to tell me about you," she said, not looking at him. "That's so." "She said you gave water to a boy and changed a whole line of people after." Clint nodded, lowering himself into the chair across from her with a grunt. "I didn't change anyone," he said. "He did that himself. I just gave what I had." The girl reached into her soaked backpack and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in plastic and tied with red twine. She handed it to him. Clint opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, handwritten. The edges were curled and stained with age. He said to bring this to you if things got bad again. He told me you'd still be here. The signature at the bottom of the letter made Clint's throat tighten. Eli. He read the letter 3 times before setting it on the table. His hands shook slightly, not from age, but from the weight of memory. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Leah?" Clint nodded, studying her face now, seeing shadows of the same strength he remembered in Eli. Watchfulness, born of hurt, but not weakness. "You hungry, Leah?" She nodded once. He stood, joints protesting, and began pulling together a meal. Eggs, toast, a bit of venison sausage he had tucked away in the freezer. She watched him the whole time, not speaking, not moving from the stove. When the food was ready, he placed the plate in front of her and sat back down. She didn't thank him, didn't have to. That night she slept on the couch, curled up tight like a cat in the corner. Clint didn't ask where she came from, or who she'd run from, or how long she planned to stay. He just added another log to the fire. The days that followed fell into quiet routine. Leah rose early, always before dawn, already dressed and sitting near the fire by the time Clint shuffled into the kitchen. She took to feeding the chickens without being asked, cleaned dishes, swept the floors. He offered her his spare coat when she went out one morning, and she accepted it without a word. They didn't talk much, but they listened to each other's silences. After a week, she began writing in the margins of an old catalog she found on the porch, a Sears issue from the 80s with yellowed pages. She tore them out, one by one, folded them into tight triangles, and placed them in a mason jar on the windowsill. On the 11th day, she handed one to Clint. He unfolded it carefully. "You don't have to be blood to be family." He nodded, then slipped the note into the front pocket of his flannel. That afternoon, he took her to the old oak behind the barn. The tree had grown thick with age, its trunk split from lightning years ago, but still alive, still sheltering birds in its canopy. At its base were the offerings, stones, feathers, beads, ribbons, all untouched. Leah stepped forward and knelt in the mud. She pulled something from her jacket pocket, a ring, silver and cracked at the band, and placed it gently among the others. She wore it every day, she said, until the last one. Clint didn't ask who, and he just bowed his head. The rain ended that night. The stars returned, and so did something else. A letter slipped through the crack in the screen door, no name on the front. Clint recognized the handwriting. Eli. I send her because she's stronger than I was at her age, and because sometimes the old ways are the only ways. She doesn't need saving, she just needs space. Let the land teach her, same as it taught me. And if she asks why you didn't ask her story, tell her it's because kindness isn't earned, it's owed. The next morning, Clint made 2 cups of coffee and left one at the table beside Leah's usual chair. She drank it black, without a grimace, without sugar, just like her uncle. She didn't ask about the letter, but he saw the corners of her mouth pull up when she folded her napkin. Another 2 months passed. Then winter returned, sudden and sharp. But the house didn't feel cold, because it wasn't just a house anymore. It was a place of remembering, a place where the lost could land softly, where silence was sacred and stories were planted like seeds, and slowly, surely, the world outside began to hear the whisper again. By the time December rolled around, Leah had been with Clint for nearly 4 months. She didn't call it home, didn't call him anything either. But her presence changed the rhythm of things. She repaired the greenhouse panels without being asked, learned to drive the old blue pickup down the gravel road with a calm hand, and left fresh firewood stacked beside the door every evening. Clint didn't ask where she went when she wandered off at dusk. He just trusted she'd return, and she always did. They had developed a language of glances, of quiet gestures. When she dropped her shoulders, it meant she needed silence. When she hummed under her breath, It meant her thoughts were moving too fast and she was trying to slow them. Clint, in turn, had become more deliberate with his movements, cleaner in his work, more present in each moment. One night during the first snowstorm of the season, Leah lit a fire in the pit behind the barn and sat cross-legged beside it, staring into the flames as they flickered against the darkness. Clint watched from the porch for a while, then stepped down into the snow and joined her. They sat shoulder to shoulder, both in their coats, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. She didn't look at him when she said, "You ever been afraid of your own blood?" Clint took a long breath. "Every day after I came home from the war." "What did you do?" "Waited for it to pass, and when it didn't, I kept living anyway." Leah nodded, pulling her knees to her chest. "I think I saw him. In town. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did and just didn't care." Clint didn't have to ask who. He'd suspected it from the bruises she never talked about, from the way she locked every door at night, from the way she sometimes startled at the sound of tires crunching gravel. "If he comes here," she started. "He won't," Clint said. "But if he does?" "He won't." She looked at him then, searching for something in his face. "How do you know?" Clint poked the fire, sending sparks into the sky. "Because this land has rules, and he already broke one." They sat in silence again, the fire the only movement between them. Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep on the couch with the dog curled against her legs, Clint wrote a single sentence in his journal. "You don't have to outrun your past if the ground beneath you refuses to let it follow." In the days that followed, the snow deepened, and the outside world shrank. The only visitors were the crows that circled the barn and the occasional fox darting across the field at dawn. Clint spent long hours whittling small figures out of cedar, birds, bears, a rabbit that never looked quite right. Leah painted them in the evenings with a handful of old brushes she found in the basement. The paint was cracked, the colors limited, but she made something beautiful from every scrap. One morning she left a blue-painted crow on his nightstand. It sat there quietly, watching him even when he turned away. A week before Christmas, the wind changed. Clint had felt it coming all morning. The sky had that strange yellow-gray hue, and the birds had vanished. By mid-afternoon, a truck pulled up the long dirt drive, black, loud, not military, not tribal. Clint stepped out onto the porch slowly, rifle resting against the wall. The door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, thin, eyes too dark. Leah stepped onto the porch behind Clint. He didn't have to turn to know she'd gone pale. "Get back inside," Clint said, voice even. The man raised his hands. "Hey now, I'm not here to cause trouble. Just want to talk to the girl." Clint's voice didn't change. "She's not yours to talk to." "She's my daughter," the man said. "She ran off, stole from me. Now I'm just here to bring her home." Behind Clint, Leah whispered, "He's lying." "I know," Clint said. The man took a step forward. "Old man, this is none of your damn business." Clint didn't move. "It became my business the day she stepped onto my land, and it stays that way as long as she needs it to." There was a long silence. The man looked past Clint to Leah. "You want this old man to die for you?" Clint raised the rifle slightly, not aimed, just ready. "You'd be surprised how much dying I've already done," he said. "Go now, and we forget this happened." The man smirked. "You gonna shoot me?" "If you make me," Clint said. The man held his stare a moment longer, then dropped it, spat on the snow, climbed back into the truck. "You'll regret this," he said, slamming the door. He drove off without looking back. Clint stood there until the sound of the engine faded. Only then did he lower the rifle. Behind him, Leah was crying, quietly, shoulders shaking. He turned, took her face in his hands gently, and looked her in the eyes. "He doesn't get to own your fear," he said. She nodded, barely. That night she left something on his chair. A folded paper with one sentence written in black marker. "You're the first place I ever felt safe." Clint tucked it into his pocket without a word, 3 days later, the riders came again. Not many, just 5. They didn't speak much, only nodded when they arrived, and set to building a ring of stones behind the barn. Leah helped them, her sleeves rolled high, her breath clouding in the frozen air. By sunset, a small fire had been lit. They sat in a circle and sang, their voices low and ancient. Leah sat beside Clint when it ended. "They said you protected sacred ground," she whispered. "I didn't do anything special," Clint replied. She shook her head. "That's the thing about sacred ground. You don't make it. You just keep it clean for the ones who need it." Winter eased its grip slowly that year. The snow melted in fits and starts, reluctant to leave the corners of the pasture and the shady side of the barn. Clint's joints ached from the cold, but he welcomed the dull pain. It reminded him he was still here, still moving, still useful. Leah stayed close in those late weeks of winter. She spoke more, though not much. When she did speak, it was thoughtful, deliberate, like each word was carved from something deeper than language. Clint listened the way he always had, with patience and no interruptions. Some days she followed him on his rounds, boots crunching behind his through the snow as they checked fence posts, scattered feed, or just watched the sunrise in silence. She was healing, though neither of them said it out loud. Healing was slow and invisible. You only saw it when someone finally laughed without apology or slept without the light on. Leah had begun doing both. One morning, toward the end of February, Clint found her in the old workshop. She was hammering something gently, her back bent over a workbench she'd cleared off. He watched from the doorway for a while, quietly. When she finally turned, she held up a necklace. It was simple, beaded leather, polished obsidian at the center, surrounded by 2 feathers carved from wood. "For you?" she said. Clint took it without a word, ran his thumb over the obsidian. "What's it mean?" She shrugged. "Protection, and that I see you." He wore it the rest of the day, hung it over his bed that night. That spring, the land woke up hard and fast. Green pushed through the soil like it had been holding its breath too long. The cattle grew restless, shaking off the memory of cold with stomps and snorts. Birds returned in droves, some Clint hadn't seen in years. Yellow warblers, flickers, the occasional hawk. One morning in early April, a van pulled into the drive, not black and shiny like the man who'd come before. This one was dented, dusty, the rear bumper held in place with duct tape. A woman stepped out, mid-50s, gray streaks in her braid. She wore a woven shawl, boots too new for this country. "I'm looking for Leah," she said, hands folded in front of her. "I was told she's here." Clint didn't answer right away. He studied the woman's face. It was tired, but not cruel. Sad, but not empty. "She is," he said. "May I see her?" "Why?" The woman shifted her weight. "Because I'm her aunt. Her mother's sister. I didn't know what was happening until it was too late. I've been looking ever since." Clint nodded slowly. "I'll ask her." Leah came down from the loft where she'd been painting. When she saw the woman, she stopped, eyes wide. "Hi, sweetheart," the woman said. Leah didn't answer. "I didn't know," her aunt continued, voice trembling. "If I had—" Leah held up a hand. "I don't want excuses." The woman swallowed hard. "That's fair." They stood facing each other, the space between them full of ghosts. Then slowly, Leah walked forward. She didn't hug her, just looked at her, long and hard. After a moment she said, "He found me. He tried to take me back." "I won't let him near you again," her aunt said, voice breaking. "You don't have to come with me. I just needed to know you were safe." "I am now." The woman nodded, and tears slipped down her cheeks. They sat together on the porch for a while, talked in soft tones Clint couldn't hear and didn't try to. Before she left, the aunt handed Clint a small book. It was her mother's, she said. She'd want her to have it. After she drove off, Clint found Leah staring at the book. She didn't open it, just held it to her chest like something sacred. "She okay?" he asked. She tried, Leah said. Maybe that's enough. That summer brought heat and abundance. Tomatoes flourished in the garden. The beehives Clint had barely managed last year doubled their yield. Leah harvested sage and wild mint with hands that had once only known how to clench. They built a bench by the oak tree. She carved words into it slowly, over weeks, for the wounded who never asked and the watchers who never turned away. People still came. A man who couldn't speak after returning from war. A girl who wrote music no one ever heard. A mother whose child had died and who needed somewhere to place her grief. They left things behind. A pair of boots, perfectly polished. A painting of a single tree. A folded American flag. A bracelet made of bullet casings and turquoise. Clint never touched what was left. He just kept space around it. Clean, quiet, protected. By the time fall came again, Clint had grown slower. He didn't walk far anymore. Spent most mornings on the porch, the blue crow Leah had painted still sitting on the windowsill beside him. She'd grown taller, stronger. Sometimes he caught her watching the road, not in fear anymore, in readiness. One afternoon, as the wind rolled in from the south and the cottonwoods shook their golden leaves loose like coins from a shaken hand, Clint sat Leah down with 2 cups of coffee and a worn folder he'd kept in a drawer since before she arrived. "What's this?" she asked. "My will," he said. She stared at him. "I don't want it." "You don't have to want it. Just need to know where things are." She shook her head. "You're not going anywhere." He smiled. "I might, one day. I don't plan to. But when it happens, I don't want anyone else making choices about this place. It's yours now. It's always been yours." Tears welled in her eyes. "But I'm not ready." "You don't have to be." She leaned her forehead against his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, the weight of years settling between them. That night she cooked dinner. They ate in silence, as they always had. Not out of absence, but out of reverence. When he went to bed, she tucked the crow back onto the windowsill and lit a candle on the porch. Just one. Small and flickering. A reminder that someone was still keeping watch. 2 weeks later, on the first frost of the season, Clint didn't wake up. He passed in his sleep. No pain, no struggle. Just breath, then silence. Leah found him in his chair, journal open in his lap. The last entry read, "This land is good. This life was full. If memory is all that's left, then let it be enough." She buried him beneath the old oak where he'd once buried a crow, a feather, and the past. People came. Some who had never met him, some who owed him more than words. No preacher, no podium, just stories, tears, silence, and then the drumbeat. Leah took his chair on the porch, planted wildflowers along the walk, painted the barn red again, the way he never had time to do. She renamed the ranch quietly. Not on paper, not on a deed, just on the gate. A wooden sign carved by hand. Weaver's Promise. Water, shelter, memory. And every time someone knocked on her door, she opened it, because Clint had once offered water without question. And in doing so, he had made her into someone who could offer the same. Spring lingered longer than usual that year, refusing to give way to the sharper edge of summer. Mornings stayed cool, the kind of cool that made coffee steam rise in thick ribbons and kept dew on the fence posts till nearly noon. Clint would have said the land was catching its breath, stretching its limbs after a long sleep. Leah said the land was waiting. When he asked what for, she only shrugged and said, "You'll know when it happens." She was 17 now, stronger in the shoulders, steadier in the eyes. She still didn't talk much, not when silence would do, but when she did speak, it carried weight. Her words had edges now, shaped by truth and the scars of remembering. She fixed the south fence on her own that April, dug post holes until her hands blistered, then kept digging. Clint offered to help, but she waved him off. "I want to do it," she said. "I want to leave something behind that holds." He understood. The fire pit behind the barn had been rebuilt, stone by stone, with a new circle added, a second ring, just inside the first, smaller and tighter. She called it the keeper's line. Only those who had stayed more than one night were allowed to step into it. They stayed, she told him. So they carry part of it now. In late May, she built a box from cedar. No nails, no glue, just joints and patience. She placed it beneath the porch bench, tucked back behind the boots Clint no longer wore. Inside, she put folded pages from her journals, feathers she found on the hill, beads gifted from a child who had cried the whole way there and left smiling. A coin stamped with the year Clint was born. A photo of him standing beside the oak, one hand resting on the trunk like it was an old friend. "Time capsule?" he asked when he saw it. "No," she said. "A memory box. For the land." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. That summer was hard. Not cruel, not blistering, just hard. The kind of hard that wears you down in small ways. The river ran lower than it had in years. The bees struggled. One of the older cows lay down and didn't get back up. They buried her on the far hill. With a rock marker Leah painted herself. Clint's cough had returned by then, dry and deep. He waved it off most days, but it stayed, tucked into the edge of his breathing like a splinter. Leah brought him tea made from wild mint and honey, sat beside him each evening and read aloud from his old journal, the one he'd written in back when he thought no one would ever read it. She read the entries slowly, carefully, like each one was a sacred story. Sometimes she'd pause and say, "You didn't know then, but that mattered." And he would nod, because she was right. The visitors didn't stop. They never did. A young man with burn scars on both arms who sang to himself as he chopped wood. A woman who brought her teenage son and asked if he could learn how to care for animals. A group of veterans who spent 3 days building a rain catch on the east side of the barn, then left without saying goodbye, only leaving behind a coin with their unit's insignia nailed to the post. It wasn't just a ranch anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was sanctuary, not with gates or walls, but with memory and reverence and silence. It was story soil. Anything planted there, grief, healing, hope, took root. That September, Clint asked Leah to bring him something from the hilltop. "A stone," he said, "the flat kind, like a page." She returned with 3. He etched words into them slowly, his hands stiff but still capable. When he was done, he gave one back to her, kept one for himself, and placed the last on the bench under the oak. Leah turned hers over in her hands for a long time before asking, "What happens when you're not here to keep all this?" Clint looked out across the land. "Then you keep it. But I don't know what to do. You'll know enough. I'm scared." He reached out and took her hand, not squeezing, just holding. "Good," he said. "Means you care." That winter came fast, the way Wyoming winters often did, on the tail of a sunny day, sneaking in with wind and quiet. Clint was slower than ever. Some days he didn't get out of bed until noon. Others he didn't get up at all. Leah did the chores, fed the animals, made meals, stoked the fire. She didn't say anything when he started keeping the lights on through the night. Didn't question the way he began to label things, his tools, his books, even his boots. On Christmas Eve, he asked her to sit with him near the fire. "You remember the first day you came?" he asked. "I remember everything." "You remember why I didn't ask any questions?" She nodded. "Because kindness isn't earned." "That's right. It's owed." She looked at him. "You taught me that." "No," he said. "The land did. I just listened." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there until the fire burned down to coals. He passed 2 weeks later, peacefully, in his sleep. The morning he didn't rise, the house didn't feel empty. It felt full, held. wrapped in all the things he had built, without bricks or concrete or titles, but with patience and stories and silence. Leah buried him beneath the oak, as he'd asked. Just her and the land and the sky. No ceremony, no priest. But the next day they came. Not because they were invited, not because she called. They came because they had always known when to return. Riders, walkers, mothers, veterans, artists, children. They stood at the oak, placed their offerings around the base, and sat in silence. Some cried, some didn't. All of them remembered. That night Leah lit the fire in the pit, stepped inside the keeper's circle, and said only one thing. He gave me water when I couldn't ask for it. Now I give it to you. Then she held out a ladle and filled a bowl with spring water. Each person stepped forward, dipped a finger in, touched their forehead or their lips or the center of their chest. It wasn't a baptism, it was a remembering. The following spring, Leah built a second cabin on the far side of the property. Just 2 rooms, a stove, a small porch, a place to stay for anyone who needed to leave something behind before they could go forward again. She didn't advertise, didn't post online. People still found it. One night a boy of about 10 knocked on the door. He didn't say anything, just stood there, backpack in hand. She didn't ask his name, just stepped aside and said, "You're safe now." Then she boiled water for tea, because she knew. Sometimes it started with nothing more than a cup of water, and a door that opened, and someone who saw you, even when you couldn't speak. The summer after Clint passed, the land bloomed like it hadn't in years. Wildflowers sprang up in impossible places, between the steps of the porch and the cracks along the stone path, even beneath the oak tree where Clint now rested, his memory rooted deeper than the earth itself. The wind carried his name in gentle breaths, the kind that wrapped around the shoulders like an old flannel shirt. Leah woke every morning at dawn just like he had, sitting with coffee on the porch, now her porch. She still used his mug. She hadn't changed anything inside the house. His boots still sat by the door, his hat hung on the same hook. She moved around them carefully, not avoiding, not holding on too tight, just letting them be part of the house, the way his voice still lived in the creak of the floorboards, the way his laugh still echoed off the walls some evenings when the fire cracked just right. People kept coming. That never changed. One morning in July, 2 brothers arrived, teenagers, one with a black eye that was already yellowing, the other with a fresh cut across the bridge of his nose. They didn't speak, not much, just asked if they could stay a night. Leah showed them the bunkhouse, fed them stew, sat outside while they tried not to cry. They left a week later, leaving behind 2 things, a baseball glove and a hand-carved walking stick. The glove went on a shelf above the hearth. The stick leaned beside Clint's old rifle. Symbols burned into the wood, simple ones, a sun, a wave, a pair of eyes. Leah added them to the map. It wasn't a literal map, not one with highways and trails. It was a hand-drawn piece of parchment mounted inside the house now, above Clint's chair. Each time someone came and left, she added a mark, a symbol of who they were, of what they carried. Not names, never names, just the weight they dropped and the story they whispered when they thought no one was listening. By autumn, the map had over 100 marks. Some were tiny, just dots or lines. Some took up whole corners, birds with broken wings, teeth marks, hands reaching toward each other. One night she stood before the map and traced every mark with her fingertip. Then she lit a candle and whispered Clint's name, because memory needed feeding too. That winter, a letter came. No return address, no postmark, just folded paper inside an envelope left beneath a stone at the gate. To whoever watches now, my father came here once. He never talked about it, but I found the journal after he passed. I recognized the way he drew this place. The fire pit, the tree, the bowl of water. I followed the sketches, and I found you. I won't stay long. I just wanted to say thank you, because whatever happened here, it gave him peace. I know it did. His son, Gabriel. Leah placed the letter in a frame and hung it beside the rain bowl on the porch. Snow began to fall that evening. Slow, quiet flakes. She stepped outside and watched them disappear into the soil. The bowl never froze. It never emptied either. That spring, a girl arrived on foot. No shoes, no jacket, no explanation. Leah met her at the edge of the pasture. The girl said nothing, just walked right up and collapsed into her arms. Leah didn't ask anything, just carried her inside, washed her feet, wrapped her in blankets, and sat beside her as she slept for almost 2 days. When she woke, the girl's first words were, "I didn't think I could make it." "You did," Leah said. "You're real?" Leah smiled. "Real enough." The girl stayed 3 months. When she left, she planted a row of sunflowers along the west fence. They bloomed the brightest Leah had ever seen. By then, people had started calling it Weaver's Refuge. No signs, no website, just word of mouth. A whisper here, a scribbled note on a bar napkin, a conversation at a rest stop between two strangers who somehow knew they were the same kind of broken. And still, Leah asked no questions. That was the rule, the only rule. Water, fire, shelter, no judgment, no demands. One evening, a woman in her 50s asked, "Why do you do this? Why not just live your own life?" Leah thought about that for a long time. Then she said, "Because someone once gave me water when I was dying, and when you're handed something like that, you don't keep it for yourself. You pass it on." The woman nodded. "Was he your father?" "No, just a man who saw me." The woman placed a folded cloth on the porch. Inside it, a lock of gray hair and a ring she no longer wore. "For the ones I lost," she said. Leah added them to the cedar box. Years passed. The oak tree grew even wider. A second rain bowl was added on the far end of the pasture. New benches were built. The map kept growing. Leah got older. Her hair grew longer. She tied it back the way Clint used to wear his bandana, wrapped once, not tight, just enough to keep the sun out of her eyes. She never moved away, never left, because the place didn't ask her to stay. It simply held her. One summer, she took in a boy named Jonah. He was 8, found sleeping under the back trailer of a long-haul truck that had stopped at the nearby gas station. No one claimed him, no missing persons report, nothing. He wouldn't speak for weeks. But he followed Leah everywhere, held her pinky finger when they walked, slept curled in a blanket by the fire. Eventually, he started to hum, then talk, then laugh. One night he asked, "Who planted all this?" She said, "A man who gave a boy a drink of water." "Why?" "Because the boy needed it." Jonah nodded. That made sense to him. When he turned 12, he carved his first stone and placed it at the tree. It read, "Sometimes people don't need saving. They just need space to stop drowning." Leah cried when she read it. Not out of sadness, out of recognition. Jonah stayed, grew, took over the chores, rebuilt the south fence again, started keeping his own journal. Then, one day, Leah handed him a folded envelope. Clint's letter, the one she had carried all those years, the one he wrote before he died. She watched as Jonah read it, then asked, "You ready to watch for a while?" He nodded, and so it passed on, like it always had, like it always would.